The chisel bit into the stone of the Samaria palace wall, and the mason carving the inscription paused to wipe grit from his eyes. He was recording a name that would outlast every king who ever wore the crown of the northern tribes. None of the men in that courtyard knew they were chiseling the epitaph of an entire kingdom. They only knew the pay was good, and the king of the day demanded his legacy carved deep. In the shadow of a golden calf, a kingdom slit its own throat. That is not a metaphor. It is a chronicle. 19 kings ruled the northern 10 tribes of Israel, and nearly every one of them walked the same path of idolatry and blood. The men who sat on that throne in Samaria did not fall one by accident. They fell by pattern. By the time the final king bowed to the Assyrian Empire, a nation chosen by God had erased itself from the map of the living. You have probably heard the story told as a simple tragedy, one bad king after another, a slide into ruin. But the harder truth is more unsettling. The kingdom did not collapse because it was attacked. It collapsed because it was hollow from the inside. And if you look closely enough at the evidence, the carved stones, the clay tablets, the layers of ash beneath the ruins, you can trace the exact moment the rot began. It started with a man named Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He was the first king of the northern tribes, and he manufactured a religion that had nothing to do with the God who brought Israel out of Egypt. He set up 2 golden calves, one at Bethel and one at Dan, and told the people, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." 1 Kings chapter 12 records the lie. That single act, that political calculation dressed as worship, became the original sin of the northern kingdom. Every king who followed Jeroboam was measured against that moment. The sacred text calls it the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And the phrase appears again and again like a scar on the page. But here is what nobody tells you about the golden calves. They were not ignorance, they were strategy. Jeroboam knew that if his people kept traveling to Jerusalem to worship, their hearts would eventually return to the house of David. So he built a religion that was easier, closer, and utterly false. The first royal dynasty died almost before it began. Jeroboam's son Nadab reigned for barely 2 years before a man named Baasha struck him down and took the throne. Baasha's own son Elah lasted less than 2 years before his servant Zimri killed him while he was drunk in the house of his steward. Zimri reigned for exactly 7 days. 7 days. Before the army turned against him and he burned the palace down around himself. The violence was not a sideshow. It was the engine of the state. Have you ever stopped to wonder why God allowed that chaos to go on for so long? The kings murdered one another, the altars multiplied, and yet the northern kingdom survived for 2 full centuries. That is the question that drives everything you are about to see. How does a kingdom chosen by God fall so completely when every warning was written down in advance? The answer is not found in a single dramatic event. It is found in a pattern, a rhythm of rebellion and judgment that plays out with terrifying precision. And the archaeological record, the monuments the kings left behind, the inscriptions they carved to celebrate their own glory, tells the same story from the other side. The stones remember what the sermons forgot. When you stand in the ruins of the northern capital and see the massive walls, the cut stone, the engineering skill, you realize these people were sophisticated, wealthy, and powerful. Their fall was not a failure of strength, it was a failure of covenant. And that is where the story takes its darkest turn, because the next dynasty to seize the throne of Samaria was the most powerful the north ever knew, and the most corrupt. Omri was a military commander who built a new capital and a new dynasty. His son Ahab married a foreign princess named Jezebel, and together they institutionalized the worship of Baal at the highest level of the state. Elijah the prophet met Ahab on the slopes of Mount Carmel. And the confrontation there was not a polite theological debate. It was a public test, a challenge laid down before the whole nation. The prophets of Baal called on their God from morning until evening, and the Bible records that they cut themselves and raved, but no voice answered. Then Elijah prayed, and fire fell from heaven and consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water in the trench around the altar. That moment in 1 Kings 18 is one of the most dramatic in all of Scripture. But here is what you have to see. Even after the fire fell, even after the people shouted that the Lord is God, the nation did not turn. Ahab went home, brooded about a vineyard he wanted, and the spiritual rot continued underneath the surface spectacle. One miracle was never going to be enough to save a kingdom that had already chosen its own destruction. The evidence of Ahab's power is not only in the Bible. In the ruins of the ancient world, an inscription was found carved in stone that mentions both the house of David and the king of Israel. It is known as the Tel Dan Stele, and it dates to roughly the 9th century before Christ. The irony is staggering. A pagan king, boasting of his victories, accidentally confirmed the very biblical history the skeptics wanted to deny. So the northern kingdom reached its peak of worldly power under the Omride dynasty, and that peak was precisely when the covenant broke most completely. The king of Israel was supposed to be a shepherd of God's people. Instead, Ahab and Jezebel turned the throne into an altar for a foreign god. The warning signs were everywhere, carved in stone and written in fire, and still the nation refused to look. The disruption was complete, but the story was far from over, because the next man to take the crown would do so in a storm of blood, and he would be remembered not as the healer of the nation, but as the one who finished the work of destruction in the name of zeal. The pattern was about to repeat itself in the most violent way yet. And if the first sin was idolatry, the second was the delusion that violence could ever repair what faithfulness had broken. Before that storm broke, though, Ahab's own son sat briefly on the throne. Ahaziah reigned only 2 years, and when he fell through the lattice of his upper room and lay injured, he sent messengers to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, rather than the God of Israel. 2 Kings chapter 1 records Elijah's response. Because the king had sought a foreign god, he would not rise from that bed, and he did not. His brother Joram took the throne next, and it was Joram who would soon meet Jehu's chariot at Jezreel. The man was Jehu, a commander of the army, and his rise to power reads like a thunderstorm. He drove his chariot furiously into Jezreel, and when the wounded King Joram came out to meet him, Jehu drew his bow and struck him down. He then hunted down Jezebel, the queen mother, and she met her end thrown from a window, her blood spattering the walls. The text records that dogs devoured her body, fulfilling the word Elijah had spoken years before. You just saw how a king who worshipped Baal accidentally confirmed the Bible's history in stone, and how Jehu's chariot stormed into Jezreel with a violence that fulfilled prophecy in the most unsettling way. If these threads, pagan inscriptions, prophecy, and blood-soaked thrones are coming together for you in a way you never noticed before, subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the unraveling. In the comments, type the word Jehu if you've heard this story before, or pattern if you're seeing the covenant rupture in a completely new light. Jehu was not punished for his violence. In fact, the Lord told him that because he had done well in executing what was right in God's eyes, his sons would sit on the throne of Israel for 4 generations. This is one of the most uncomfortable passages in the whole Bible. God used Jehu as an instrument of judgment, and yet Jehu himself did not walk faithfully. He destroyed the worship of Baal, yes, but he never turned away from the golden calves of Jeroboam. Here is the chilling detail. Jehu was willing to destroy his enemies' idols, but he would not touch his own. His zeal had limits, and those limits were drawn exactly where his own power began. He was a reformer who reformed everything except himself. And that is the trap that every subsequent king walked into, generation after generation. What you are watching is not a series of random accidents. It is a spiral, a descending staircase where each step is a little lower than the last. The prophet Hosea described it in painful terms, calling the nation an unfaithful wife who had forgotten her first husband. Amos saw it too, a plumb line held against a wall that was already leaning. The prophets were not fortune tellers. They were the nation's conscience, and the nation sold its conscience for political stability and false worship. But here is the part that raises the stakes. While the northern kingdom spiraled, the world around it was growing darker. The Assyrian Empire was rising in the east, a military machine like nothing the ancient world had seen. Their armies moved with terrifying efficiency, and their kings recorded their campaigns on massive carved reliefs that still survive today. Israel was not falling in a vacuum. It was falling while a predator circled. The kings of Israel seemed oblivious. The son of Jehu, Jehoahaz, was weak, and the text says the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. His son Jehoash reigned 16 years, and according to 2 Kings chapter 13, wept at the deathbed of the prophet Elisha, who told him he would defeat Aram 3 times. Jehoash also defeated King Amaziah of Judah in battle, broke down a section of Jerusalem's wall, and carried off temple treasure. A humiliation of the southern kingdom by its own northern kin. His son Jeroboam II, however, was a different story. He reigned for over 40 years and restored Israel's borders to something like their former glory. The kingdom was wealthy, its trade flourishing, its army strong. On the surface, everything looked like success. Look closer, and the rot was absolute. The prophet Amos, a herdsman from the south, came to the northern sanctuary at Bethel and delivered a devastating message. He spoke of people who sold the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. He described luxury and complacency, and his words paint a picture of a wealthy society that had completely forgotten the God who gave them everything. And here is the irony. The people of Israel thought they were blessed. They went to their temples, offered their sacrifices, and felt very religious. In the ruins of Samaria, excavators have found thousands of pottery fragments known as ostraca. These are essentially receipts, records of wine and oil shipments, written in ink on broken pottery. They show a kingdom that was economically thriving and administratively organized. The wealth was real. The only thing missing was faithfulness, and the prophets were screaming into that void, their words preserved in sacred texts, their warnings ignored until it was far too late. Have you ever felt that ache watching a family or a church or a nation that has everything except the one thing that matters? That is the feeling this history is designed to provoke. It is not a distant academic exercise. It is a mirror held up to every generation that confuses prosperity with blessing and activity with faithfulness. Jehu's dynasty finally ended when his great-great-grandson Zechariah was assassinated after only 6 months on the throne. The text simply says he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, as his fathers had done, and he did not turn away from the sin of Jeroboam. His killer, Shallum, reigned for exactly 1 month before he too was murdered. The kingdom was now devouring its own rulers faster than they could be replaced. What followed was the most chaotic stretch in the northern kingdom's history. A man named Menahem seized power and reigned for about 10 years, but he did so by becoming a vassal of Assyria, paying tribute to keep his throne. His son Pekahiah lasted 2 years before his own officer. Pekah killed him in the royal palace. Pekah then reigned for 20 years and allied with the kingdom of Syria against Judah. A catastrophic miscalculation. The Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III responded by invading, and the territory of the northern kingdom was carved up. The biblical text in 2 Kings chapter 15 lists the regions that were torn away, and the people were deported. The spiral was tightening, and the end was now visible on the horizon. The kingdom of Israel had been reduced from a nation to a rump state, a client of the empire, and still it could not stop. A new king, Hoshea, came to the throne by conspiracy. He assassinated Pekah and made a deal with Assyria. For a few years he paid tribute and the situation stabilized. But then Hoshea made the single most foolish decision of the entire northern kingdom's history. He sent messengers to the king of Egypt seeking an alliance, and he stopped paying tribute to Assyria. It was an act of rebellion that sealed the nation's fate. The Assyrian king Shalmaneser V marched against Israel, besieged Samaria, and after a siege that lasted roughly 3 years, the city fell. The date is generally placed around the year 722 before Christ, though some scholars place it a year or two later. The northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist. The capital was destroyed, the people were deported, and foreign populations were brought in to replace them. A policy that would forever change the land. And that change wasn't just a political shift. It was the moment the land became a parable, a warning written in soil and stone that the prophets would echo for centuries. If you want to keep walking through the evidence and see where every artifact points, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if the deportation of the northern kingdom settled heavy in your chest, type the word exile in the comments, because the archaeological proof of what happened to those captives is one of the most startling threads we're about to pull. Think about the sensory reality of that final siege. Imagine the smell of smoke, the sound of battering rams pounding the walls, the cries of the defenders, the hunger that gnawed at every belly inside the city. For 3 years they held out, hoping for help from Egypt that never came, trusting an alliance that was nothing but a promise in the wind. And when the walls finally broke, the Assyrians did what they always did. They took the elite, the craftsmen, the leaders, and marched them into exile. The 10 tribes scattered across the empire, and history remembers them as the lost tribes of Israel. The archaeological evidence for the fall of Samaria is not hidden. The Assyrian king Sargon II, who likely completed the siege after Shalmaneser died, boasted of the conquest in his own inscriptions. In the ruins of his palace at Khorsabad, reliefs and texts record the deportation of the people of Samaria. The biblical account and the Assyrian record tell the same story from both sides of the battlefield. The kingdom did not fall because God was weak. It fell because God's warnings were true. The kings faded, but the inscriptions outlived them by 3,000 years. This channel exists because people like you care enough to keep reading what the stones still say. The link is below. Every single witness, the carved stone, the written word, the layers of ash in the excavation, says the same thing. The kingdom of Israel was given every chance to turn back, and it refused. The prophets were not vague mystics. They were men who named the sin, called the date, and described the consequence before it arrived. None of it was hidden. The people just chose not to hear. The fall of Samaria was not an isolated event in the sacred narrative. It was the first half of a 2-part judgment, and the second half would strike the southern kingdom of Judah with equal force. But Judah's story ran on a different clock, and it contained moments of genuine hope that the north never knew. That contrast is where the deeper meaning of this history begins to surface. While the northern tribes were spiraling into oblivion, the southern kingdom of Judah was experiencing its own cycles of faithfulness and failure. The line of David remained on the throne, unbroken for centuries, and that continuity matters more than you might think. It is the thread that connects the collapse of Israel to the promise that would eventually emerge from the ruins. 12 rulers sat on that throne before Hezekiah, and their story is its own pattern of near misses and collapse. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, lost the 10 northern tribes through his own arrogance and is recorded in 1 Kings chapter 12. His son Abijah reigned briefly, and then Asa, his grandson, ruled for over 40 years and removed many of the idols, though the high places remained. Jehoshaphat followed, allying unwisely with the northern kingdom through marriage, a decision whose cost would soon become clear. That marriage brought Athaliah, daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, into the royal house of David. When her son Jehoram died, and then his son Ahaziah was killed, alongside Israel's king Joram by Jehu's men, Athaliah seized the throne herself and murdered nearly the entire royal family to secure it, the only woman to ever rule Judah outright, and recorded in 2 Kings chapter 11 as reigning 6 years before the priest Jehoiada hid the infant Joash and staged a coup that restored the line of David. Joash reigned faithfully while Jehoiada lived, repairing the temple, but drifted into idolatry after the priest's death and was assassinated by his own officials. His son Amaziah defeated Edom, but foolishly provoked Jehoash of Israel into the humiliating war already mentioned. Amaziah's son Uzziah reigned over 50 years and made Judah prosperous, but he was struck with leprosy after unlawfully burning incense in the temple, and lived out his days quarantined, while his son Jotham governed in his place. Jotham was followed by Ahaz, who plunged the kingdom back into open idolatry, sacrificed his own son in the fire, and stripped the temple to pay tribute to Assyria, setting the stage for the son who would try to undo it all. The southern kings included Hezekiah, Ahaz's son, a ruler remembered as one of the most faithful in Judah's long history. He tore down the high places, shattered the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles that had polluted the land. Hezekiah's reform was not cosmetic. It reached into the very fabric of worship, and the text records that he kept the commands of the Lord in a way that no king before him had matched. But Hezekiah's most striking achievement was not spiritual. It was engineering. When an Assyrian army under Sennacherib invaded, Hezekiah prepared Jerusalem for siege by cutting a tunnel through solid rock, bringing water from the spring outside the city walls into a pool within them. That tunnel still exists today, and you can walk through it. In the 19th century, an inscription was found carved into its wall, describing the moment the two teams of workers met in the middle, their picks breaking through from opposite directions. The siege itself ended in one of the most dramatic events in the entire Bible. The Assyrian army surrounded Jerusalem. The field commander shouted threats in Hebrew so the people on the walls could understand, and the city seemed doomed. Then Hezekiah prayed, and the prophet Isaiah sent word that the Lord would defend the city. That night, the text records, an angel struck down a vast number of the Assyrian army, and Sennacherib withdrew to Nineveh, where he was eventually killed by his own sons. The archaeological record does not contradict this. Sennacherib's own annals boast of shutting up Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage, but they never claim to have captured the city. The silence in the Assyrian record is as loud as the triumph in the biblical one. And the tunnel Hezekiah built still carries water, a living monument to a king who trusted God when the empire came knocking. Jerusalem survived and the line of David continued, but the pattern of the north was still at work in the south, and the next king proved it. Hezekiah's son Manasseh reigned for over 50 years, the longest of any king of Judah, and he undid everything his father had accomplished. He rebuilt the high places, erected altars to Baal, and even placed an Asherah pole in the temple itself. The text says he shed so much innocent blood that Jerusalem was filled from one end to another. Manasseh is the hinge of Judah's fall, the moment when the southern kingdom chose the path of the north. And yet, buried in the Chronicles, there is a strange and almost forgotten detail. The text records that Manasseh was eventually taken captive by the Assyrians, led away in chains, and that in his distress he humbled himself before the Lord. He prayed, and God heard him and brought him back to Jerusalem. He subsequently tore down the idols he had built and restored the worship of the true God. It is a story of late repentance, a flicker of hope at the very edge of the abyss. That hope did not hold. Manasseh's son Amon was assassinated after 2 years, and his successor, Josiah, came to the throne as a boy of 8. Josiah was the last great reformer of Judah, and his story contains one of the most remarkable discoveries in all of biblical archaeology. In the 18th year of his reign, while the temple was being repaired, the high priest found a book, the Book of the Law. When it was read to Josiah, he tore his robes because he understood how far the nation had drifted from its commands. The discovery of that hidden book changed everything, and the story of Josiah's reform shows how a single artifact can reorient a nation's soul. Subscribe if you want to continue uncovering the relics that shape our faith, and in the comments, share the word Torah if you're moved by the mystery of a lost scroll altering history. That discovery launched a nationwide reform. Josiah destroyed the altars, smashed the idols, and reinstituted the Passover in a way that had not been seen since the days of the judges. He even extended his purge into the territories of the northern tribes, cleansing the land that had once belonged to the fallen kingdom. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Judah might escape the fate of its northern neighbor. The covenant could be renewed. The pattern could be broken. But Josiah's reform was too late, and it was not deep enough. The text makes clear that even as the king tore down the idols, the people's hearts had not truly turned. And Josiah himself made a fatal mistake. He marched out to confront the Egyptian army at Megiddo, despite being warned not to interfere, and he was killed in battle. The last great hope of Judah died on a plain in the north, and with him died the final chance to avert the coming storm. The 4 kings who followed Josiah were a study in collapse. Jehoahaz reigned for 3 months before being deposed by the Egyptians. His brother Jehoiakim was placed on the throne as a puppet, and he reversed Josiah's reforms, bringing back the idols and the injustice. When the Babylonian Empire rose to replace Assyria, Jehoiakim switched his allegiance, rebelled, and died during the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem. His son Jehoiakim reigned for exactly 3 months before the city fell, and he was taken captive to Babylon, along with the queen mother, the officials, and the craftsmen. The final king was Zedekiah, a man the prophet Jeremiah described as weak and indecisive. He was placed on the throne by Babylon, but he too rebelled, and the response was total. The Babylonian army returned, besieged Jerusalem for nearly 2 years, and this time there was no deliverance. The walls were breached, the temple was burned, and the city was systematically destroyed. The text records the horror plainly. The sons of Zedekiah were killed before his eyes, and then his eyes were put out, and he was led away in chains to Babylon. The archaeological evidence of this catastrophe is unmistakable. In the ruins of Jerusalem, excavators have found a layer of ash from the destruction, thick and black, marking the moment the city burned. Letters written on pottery shards known as the Lachish Letters preserve the desperate communications between the outpost of Lachish and Jerusalem during the final Babylonian campaign. One of them contains a heartbreaking line. The watchman at the gate said he could no longer see the signal fires from Azekah. The city was falling, one fortress at a time, and there was no hope left. And there is one more piece of physical evidence, small but haunting. A clay tablet in the Babylonian archives records the rations given to prisoners, including a man named Jehoiakim, the exiled king of Judah. He was alive, an exile in a foreign land, his kingdom gone, his temple destroyed. The tablet is a receipt, a scrap of administrative bureaucracy, and it preserves the memory of a king who had lost everything. The monarchy was over. The covenant seemed broken beyond repair. That list of rations for a blinded king, it is a silent witness to a covenant that felt shattered. If you want to see how the evidence continues to unfold, subscribe now, because what comes next is the hinge of the entire story. And in the comments, I invite you to type one word: ration. If that small clay receipt felt heavier than the fall of the walls. You have watched an entire civilization walk the same path, century after century, ignoring every warning, repeating every mistake. That is the ache this history leaves in the chest. It is the sorrow of watching something precious destroy itself while shouting that it knows better. And if you have ever felt that weight about your own family, your own church, your own nation, you already understand why the prophets wept. But here is where the story turns, because the biblical narrative refuses to end in the ashes. The prophets who had predicted the destruction also spoke of a future beyond it. Jeremiah, the same prophet who had watched Jerusalem burn, wrote a letter to the exiles telling them to build houses, plant gardens, and pray for the city where they lived. And in the same sacred text, he recorded a promise. The Lord would make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant they had broken, but one written on their hearts. The exile was not the end of the story. It was the forge. And somewhere in the ruins of Jerusalem, in the silence after the flames, a new kind of kingdom was already being whispered. Not a kingdom of walls and thrones, but one that could never be destroyed. That whisper would grow into a hope that outlasted empires, and it still echoes today. A mason chiseled a king's name into stone, never knowing which name would survive 3,000 years. This channel exists because people like you keep those names and the evidence behind them from being forgotten. The link is below.